My name is Isabella, and I am 22 years old. Last month, I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a degree in biomedical engineering. That night should have been the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it became the moment my entire world shattered. At what was supposed to be my celebration dinner, my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said words that would change everything: "We wish you were never born." But what happened next? Nobody in my family saw it coming. The revenge I planned would destroy them all, and the truth I uncovered would break their precious little empire into pieces. Before we dive into this wild family drama, I want to know, where are you watching from today? If you are ready to hear how I completely dismantled my toxic family and served them the coldest revenge imaginable, smash that like button and subscribe because this story gets absolutely insane. Trust me, you will want to stick around for what my so-called loving family had coming to them. The restaurant my parents chose for my graduation dinner was Le Bernardin, one of those impossibly expensive places in Manhattan where they serve tiny portions on massive plates and the waitstaff treats you like royalty. My father, Robert, had made the reservation months in advance, telling me how proud he was that his daughter was graduating from one of the most prestigious universities in the world. My mother, Patricia, had even bought a new designer dress for the occasion, a sleek black number that probably cost more than most people make in a month. I should have known something was wrong from the moment I walked into that restaurant. The atmosphere felt different, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl. My parents sat stiffly across from me, their faces masks of polite civility that I had mistaken for pride my entire life. My younger brother Marcus, 19 and perpetually glued to his phone, barely looked up when I arrived. Even my older sister Vivian, 25 and usually the peacemaker in our family, seemed unusually quiet and distant. The first hour passed normally enough. We ordered appetizers, talked about my job prospects at several biotech companies, and discussed my plans to pursue a master's degree. My father dominated the conversation as usual, pontificating about market trends and investment opportunities while my mother nodded along and made appropriate sounds of agreement. I found myself studying their faces, looking for signs of the pride and love I so desperately wanted to see reflected back at me. It was not until the main courses arrived that the mask began to slip. My father started talking about family legacy, about how important it was to maintain certain standards and expectations. He spoke about bloodlines and inheritance, about the responsibility that came with bearing the family name. The way he looked at me when he said these things made my stomach turn, though I could not quite put my finger on why. Then my mother set down her wine glass and fixed me with a stare that could have frozen hell itself. "Isabella," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of controlled disdain that I had grown up hearing but never quite understanding. "Your father and I have been discussing your future, and we think it is time you knew the truth about some things." The restaurant seemed to fade away around us. The clatter of silverware, the murmur of other diners, the soft jazz playing in the background, it all became white noise as I focused entirely on my mother's face. Something in her expression told me that whatever was coming next would change everything. "We know about the Stanford scholarship," she continued, her voice never wavering from that same cold, measured tone. "We know about the research grants, the internships, all of it. You have worked very hard to get where you are, and we suppose that is admirable in its own way." I felt my brow furrow in confusion. "What do you mean, you suppose it is admirable? I thought you were proud of me. I thought this dinner was to celebrate my achievements." My father cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Isabella, what your mother is trying to say is that your achievements, while impressive on paper, have created something of a problem for our family." "A problem?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "You see, darling," my mother said, the endearment dripping with sarcasm, "when you were born, we had certain expectations about how our children would develop. We had plans, hopes, dreams about the kind of family we would build together." Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Marcus finally looked up from his phone, his face pale and drawn. Whatever was happening here, they both knew about it. They were in on it. Your siblings understand their place in this family, my father continued. They understand what is expected of them, what their roles are supposed to be. But you, Isabella, you have always been different. You have always pushed boundaries, asked too many questions, demanded too much attention. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture so ugly and devastating that my mind rebelled against accepting it. What are you saying? I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer. My mother smiled then, but it was not a smile of warmth or love. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting years to deliver a killing blow and was finally getting their chance. What we are saying, Isabella, is that you were a mistake. A beautiful, intelligent, accomplished mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the color drain from my face. Around us, other diners continued their conversations, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was imploding just a few feet away. We wish you were never born, my mother said, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if she were commenting on the weather. Your father and I have discussed this extensively over the years, and we have come to the conclusion that our family would have been better off if you had never existed. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was hearing. These were the people who had raised me, who had attended my school plays and soccer games, who had helped me with homework and driven me to countless extracurricular activities. How could they sit there and tell me so casually that they wished I had never been born? But do not worry, my father added with that same cold smile. We have come up with a solution that will work for everyone involved. What kind of solution? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. We are cutting you off, my mother said simply. No more family money, no more trust fund, no more safety net. You wanted to be so independent, so successful on your own? Well, now you will get your chance. The restaurant suddenly felt too hot, too crowded, too bright. I could feel panic rising in my chest as the full implications of what they were saying began to sink in. They were not just rejecting me emotionally, they were cutting me off financially as well, leaving me to fend for myself in a world that suddenly seemed much more hostile and uncertain. But as I sat there, watching my parents' satisfied expressions and my siblings' guilty faces, something else began to grow inside me alongside the panic and hurt. It was cold and hard and infinitely more dangerous than the raw emotion I had felt moments before. It was rage. Pure, crystalline rage that burned away everything else and left behind only one thought: they would pay for this. All of them would pay. I did not cry at that table. I did not scream or throw my wine glass or storm out of the restaurant like some dramatic character in a bad movie. Instead, I did something that would prove far more dangerous to my family than any emotional outburst could have been. I got very, very quiet, and I started to think. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. My parents sat there watching me with the kind of clinical interest scientists might show when observing a lab rat navigate a maze. They were waiting for me to break down, to beg, to promise I would be different if they would just take back those horrible words. They were waiting for me to prove that I was exactly the weak, dependent creature they believed me to be. They had no idea that in those moments of devastating silence, I was methodically dismantling everything I thought I knew about my family and rebuilding it into something far more accurate and infinitely more useful. Every seemingly loving gesture from my childhood was being re-examined through this new lens. Every family vacation, every birthday party, every proud moment they had claimed to share with me was being stripped of its false veneer and revealed for what it truly was. Performance art designed to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I see, I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. And this decision is final? My mother actually looked surprised by my calm response. She had been expecting tears, recriminations, desperate pleas for forgiveness. Instead, she got the cool professionalism of someone conducting a business transaction. Well, yes, darling. We have given this considerable thought, and we believe it is best for everyone involved. Best for everyone, I repeated slowly, letting the words roll around on my tongue like I was tasting something bitter. I understand. And my siblings are aware of this decision? Vivian finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Bella, we tried to talk them out of it. We really did. But they have their minds made up, and you know how they get when they have decided something. Oh, I know exactly how they get, I replied, turning my attention to my sister. What I am curious about is how long all of you have known about this plan. The guilty look that flashed across Marcus's face told me everything I needed to know. This was not some spur-of-the-moment decision made in anger or disappointment. This was something they had been planning for weeks, maybe months. They had all sat around our family dinner table, probably multiple times, discussing the best way to destroy me while I remained completely oblivious to the knife they were preparing to plunge into my back. It does not matter how long we have known, my father said, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. What matters is that you understand your new situation and adjust your expectations accordingly. My expectations, I said, nodding thoughtfully. You know, Dad, you are absolutely right. I do need to adjust my expectations. In fact, I think this conversation has been incredibly valuable in helping me understand exactly what kind of people I have been dealing with all these years. Something in my tone must have alerted him to the danger he was in because his eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly do you mean by that? I stood up slowly, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate precision. What I mean is that you have just given me the greatest gift possible. You have shown me exactly who you really are, and now I know exactly how to proceed. Isabella, sit down, my mother hissed, clearly concerned about making a scene in such an upscale establishment. People are starting to stare. Let them stare, I said, loud enough for the tables around us to hear. Let them see what happens when parents decide to publicly humiliate and abandon their daughter at what should have been a celebration of her achievements. The color drained from my father's face as he realized I was not going to go quietly into whatever exile they had planned for me. Lower your voice this instant, young lady. Or what? I asked, genuinely curious. You will cut me off? Disown me? Wish I was never born? I think we have already covered that ground, do not you? I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, carefully extracting several bills and placing them on the table. This should cover my portion of the meal, I said, my voice returning to that same eerily calm tone that was clearly unnerving my family. I would not want anyone to think I was taking advantage of your generosity. Where do you think you are going? My mother demanded. I am going to start my new life, I replied simply. The one where I do not have to pretend to love people who find my very existence to be an inconvenience. The one where I can stop wasting my time trying to earn approval from people who decided long ago that I was not worthy of it. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at them one more time. They all sat there staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to anger to what might have been the first stirrings of regret. Good. They should be worried. Oh, and one more thing, I said, smiling for the first time since this nightmare had begun. You might want to have your attorney review the family trust documents sometime soon. I have a feeling there are going to be some interesting developments in that area over the next few months. The look of pure terror that crossed my father's face was worth every moment of pain and humiliation I had endured that night. He knew, as I had suspected, that there were vulnerabilities in their precious financial empire. Vulnerabilities that someone with my education and determination might be able to exploit if they were motivated enough. And I was very, very motivated. I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, ignoring the curious stares of other diners and the frantic whispered conversation that had erupted at my family's table. I did not look back, not even once. That chapter of my life was over, and I was already focused on writing the next one. The night air hit my face like a slap, cold and sharp and infinitely cleaner than the toxic atmosphere I had just escaped. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the reality of my situation sink in. I was alone in one of the most expensive cities in the world with nothing but my education, my determination, and a burning desire for justice. It would have to be enough. Because what my family did not understand was that they had not just cut me loose, they had set me free. Free from the obligation to love them, free from the need to seek their approval, and most importantly, free from any moral constraints about what I might do to them in return. They wanted me gone? Fine. But I was going to make sure they remembered exactly why that was such a terrible mistake. The first thing I did after leaving that restaurant was check into a modest hotel near Columbia University. Nothing fancy, nothing that would drain my carefully saved money too quickly, but clean and safe and most importantly, completely separate from anything connected to my family. I paid for a week up front and spent the first night lying awake in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and letting the full scope of my situation crystallize in my mind. By morning, the emotional shock had faded, replaced by something far more dangerous, clarity. I ordered room service coffee and opened my laptop, ready to begin the most important research project of my life. If my family wanted to play games with trust funds and inheritance law, they had picked the wrong opponent. What they had forgotten in their arrogance was that I had not just graduated summa cum laude from Stanford. I had also completed a minor in economics with a focus on corporate finance. I understood money, how it moved, how it was protected, and most importantly, how it could be weaponized. The first item on my agenda was understanding exactly what I was walking away from. I logged into the family trust documents that I had access to as a beneficiary and began downloading everything I could find. Account statements, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, business partnerships. I saved it all to an encrypted drive that I had purchased specifically for this purpose. What I found in those documents was even more interesting than I had hoped. My father's business empire was far more complex and far more vulnerable than he had ever let on. Robert Ashworth Holdings was not just a successful investment firm, it was a carefully constructed house of cards built on leveraged debt, questionable partnerships, and what appeared to be some very creative interpretations of tax law. The family money that they were so eager to withhold from me was not nearly as secure as they wanted everyone to believe. But the real goldmine was what I found when I started digging into the family trust itself. The document was nearly 40 pages long and filled with the kind of legal language designed to confuse and intimidate anyone who tried to understand it. Fortunately, I had taken enough business law courses to navigate the maze of clauses and subclauses, and what I discovered made me smile for the first time since that disastrous dinner. The trust had been established by my grandfather when I was 5 years old, and it contained some very specific language about the rights and responsibilities of beneficiaries. More importantly, it contained language about what constituted grounds for removing someone from the trust versus what constituted illegal interference with a beneficiary's rights. My parents, in their eagerness to cut me off, had apparently forgotten to consult the actual legal documents that governed their ability to do so. I spent the next 3 days becoming an expert on trust law, reading case studies and legal precedents until my eyes burned. I learned about fiduciary duty, about the legal obligations trustees had to beneficiaries, and about the very specific circumstances under which someone could be removed from a trust. What my parents had done to me at that restaurant was not just morally reprehensible, it was potentially illegal. But I was not ready to play that card yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how deep their vulnerabilities went. I called my former roommate from Stanford, a brilliant computer science major named Jessica who now worked for a major tech company in Silicon Valley. We had stayed close throughout college, bonding over late-night study sessions and our shared frustration with privileged classmates who took their advantages for granted. When I explained my situation to her, she was horrified by my family's behavior and more than willing to help me do some digital reconnaissance. Jessica had connections throughout the tech industry, and within 48 hours, she had put me in touch with a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial irregularities in family businesses. The woman, Helen Martinez, was a former FBI investigator who had gone into private practice and made a name for herself exposing white-collar crime. When I explained what I suspected about my father's business practices, she agreed to take a preliminary look at the documents I had gathered. What Helen found exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Robert Ashworth Holdings was not just creatively interpreting tax law, they were actively evading it. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fraudulent investment schemes designed to funnel money away from legitimate investors and into my family's personal accounts. The scope of the illegal activity was staggering, and the potential penalties were severe enough to destroy not just the business, but the entire family fortune. "Your father has been running this scheme for at least 15 years, Helen told me during our video call. The total amount of unpaid taxes alone would be in the millions, and that is before we factor in the investor fraud and money laundering charges that would inevitably follow." "How long would he go to prison for something like this?" I asked. "Federal sentencing guidelines for this level of financial crime? Probably 20 to 30 years, assuming he was convicted on all counts. Your mother would likely face charges as well, since she is listed as a co-owner of several of the shell companies." I felt a thrill of dark satisfaction run through me. My parents had spent decades building their precious empire through lies and theft, and they had the audacity to tell me that I was the problem with this family. The irony was almost too perfect. But I still was not ready to make my move. I needed more ammunition, more ways to ensure that when I brought my family down, they would not be able to recover. That meant understanding their social vulnerabilities as well as their financial ones. I started reaching out to people from my past, former family friends and business associates who might be willing to share information about my parents' reputation in their social circles. What I learned painted a picture of a family that was respected and feared in equal measure, but not particularly well liked. My father had a reputation for ruthless business practices, and my mother was known for her cutting social commentary and exclusionary attitude toward anyone she deemed beneath her station. More importantly, I learned that their social standing was built almost entirely on the perception of wealth and success. If that foundation were to crumble, if people were to discover that the Ashworth fortune was built on criminal activity, the social consequences would be almost as devastating as the legal ones. I also discovered that I was not the only person my parents had wronged over the years. There were business partners who felt cheated, employees who had been unfairly terminated, and former friends who had been cast aside when they were no longer useful. A plan began to form in my mind, one that would turn all of these grievances into weapons that I could use against my family. The final piece of my puzzle came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. 3 days after our disastrous dinner, he called me from his dorm room at Columbia, his voice shaking with guilt and fear. "Bella, I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "What Mom and Dad did to you was wrong, and I think you should know that it was not just about you being independent or asking too many questions." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew where this was going. "There's something else, something they made me promise not to tell you. But after seeing how they treated you at dinner, I cannot keep quiet about it anymore." "What is it, Marcus?" He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You are not their biological daughter, Bella. You are adopted, and they have been planning to cut you out of the inheritance for years. The trust fund, the family money, none of it was ever really meant for you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but instead of devastation, I felt something else entirely, liberation. Everything made sense now. The way they had always treated me differently, the subtle exclusion from family traditions, the constant feeling that I was performing for an audience that would never truly accept me. They had lied to me my entire life, and now they expected me to simply disappear quietly into whatever exile they had planned for me. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on lies? Drop a comment below because this story is about to get absolutely wild, and you are definitely going to want to see how I made them all pay for what they did to me. Armed with the truth about my adoption and the evidence of my family's criminal activities, I spent the next 2 weeks crafting what would become the most satisfying revenge plot of my life. I was not going to simply expose them. I was going to systematically dismantle everything they had built, piece by carefully constructed piece. My first move was to contact the Internal Revenue Service. I had Helen Martinez prepare a comprehensive report detailing every financial irregularity she had discovered, complete with supporting documentation and a clear timeline of illegal activities. The IRS has a whistleblower program that provides monetary rewards for information leading to successful prosecutions of tax evasion, which meant I would actually profit from destroying my family's criminal enterprise. But I wanted more than just financial compensation. I wanted to watch their world burn from the inside out. I reached out to every business partner, investor, and associate who had been wronged by my father over the years. Using the skills I had learned in my biomedical engineering program, I approached each conversation like a carefully controlled experiment, gathering data and building a coalition of people who had their own reasons for wanting to see Robert Ashworth Holdings destroyed. The response was overwhelming. Apparently, my father had made many more enemies than friends during his climb to the top, and there were dozens of people who would be thrilled to help bring him down if they thought they could do so safely. I provided them with carefully selected pieces of the evidence I had gathered, just enough to show them that their suspicions about my father's business practices were correct, but not enough to compromise the larger investigation. Meanwhile, I began reaching out to journalists who specialized in financial crime reporting. I knew that the IRS investigation would take months or even years to complete, but a well-placed media story could destroy my family's reputation overnight. I found a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who had been investigating suspicious investment schemes in the New York area, and I anonymously provided her with enough information to start asking the right questions. The beauty of my plan was its inevitability. Once the dominoes started falling, there would be no way for my family to stop the avalanche of consequences heading their way. Every move they made to protect themselves would only create more evidence of their guilt, more ammunition for the prosecutors and journalists and angry investors who were circling like sharks. But I saved the most personal attack for last. 3 weeks after that horrible dinner, I called a family meeting. I sent identical messages to my parents and siblings, requesting that they meet me at our family's summer house in the Hamptons. I told them I had come to terms with their decision to cut me off and that I wanted to discuss the transition in a more private setting than a public restaurant. They agreed immediately, probably relieved that I was finally behaving the way they expected me to. They thought I was coming to grovel, to beg for forgiveness and ask to be welcomed back into the family fold. They had no idea that I was coming to deliver the killing blow. I arrived at the house first, letting myself in with the key I had kept since childhood. The place looked exactly the same as it always had: expensive furniture, priceless artwork, and an overwhelming sense of cold perfection that had never felt like home to me. I set up my laptop in the living room and waited for my family to arrive. They came together, probably having discussed their strategy for handling whatever emotional breakdown they expected me to have. My mother looked elegant and untouchable as always, my father wore his usual expression of barely concealed impatience, and my siblings trailed behind them looking guilty and uncomfortable. "Isabella," my mother said, settling into her favorite armchair like a queen taking her throne. "We are so glad you reached out to us. We were hoping you would come to your senses about this whole situation." "Oh, I have definitely come to my senses," I replied, opening my laptop and pulling up the first slide of the presentation I had prepared. "In fact, I have learned quite a lot over the past few weeks. Things that I think the whole family should know about." The first slide contained a photograph of the trust document that had established my inheritance rights, along with highlighted sections that clearly outlined my legal status as a beneficiary. "For instance, I learned that what you did to me at that restaurant was not just morally reprehensible, it was actually illegal. As trustees of this family trust, you have a fiduciary duty to protect the interests of all beneficiaries. Cutting me off based on personal animosity constitutes a breach of that duty." My father's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Isabella, I think you may be misunderstanding some complex legal concepts." "Am I?" I clicked to the next slide, which contained a detailed breakdown of the criminal activities Helen Martinez had uncovered. Or am I misunderstanding the tax evasion scheme you have been running for the past 15 years? The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent investment partnerships that have stolen millions of dollars from legitimate investors? The silence in the room was deafening. My mother's carefully controlled expression had cracked, revealing the fear underneath. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick, while Vivian stared at the screen in horror. "Where did you get this information?" my father demanded, his voice shaking with rage and panic. "Does it matter?" I asked. "What matters is that I have already provided copies of everything to the IRS, the FBI, and several journalists who specialize in white-collar crime. What matters is that by the end of this week, everyone in your social circle is going to know exactly what kind of people you really are." I clicked to the final slide, which contained a simple message: "You wished I was never born. Congratulations, you are about to get your wish." By the time the investigations are complete, the Ashworth family, as you know, it will no longer exist. My mother tried one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Isabella, surely we can work something out. Perhaps we were too hasty in our decision about your place in the family." I closed the laptop and stood up, looking around the room one last time at the people who had raised me to believe they loved me. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said. "If you had just accepted me for who I was, if you had treated me like a real member of this family instead of some unwelcome burden, I would have spent my entire life protecting you. I would have used my skills and my education to help you build something legitimate and lasting." I headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at them one more time. "But instead, you chose to destroy me. So I chose to destroy you back. The difference is, I am actually good at it." The last thing I heard as I walked out of that house was my mother calling my name, her voice breaking with desperation. But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion, and nothing they could do would stop what was coming. The first domino fell exactly 72 hours after my family meeting. I was sitting in a coffee shop near Columbia University, working on my graduate school applications, when my phone started buzzing with news alerts. The Wall Street Journal had published their investigation into Robert Ashworth Holdings, complete with detailed allegations of tax evasion, investor fraud, and money laundering. The headline read, "Prominent investment firm under investigation for alleged financial crimes spanning 15 years. I allowed myself a small smile as I read through the article. The journalist had done excellent work, connecting dots that painted a damning picture of systematic criminal activity. More importantly, she had included quotes from several of the investors I had connected her with, people who were now publicly alleging that they had been defrauded by my father's company. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Jessica, calling from California with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Bella, have you seen the news? Your father's company is all over the financial channels. They are saying it could be one of the biggest investment fraud cases in New York this year." "I saw it," I replied calmly. "How are the markets reacting?" "Ashworth Holdings stock has been suspended from trading pending the investigation. Their corporate clients are fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. It is absolutely beautiful." But this was just the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, the story exploded across multiple media platforms. Television news programs picked up the investigation, financial bloggers dissected every aspect of my father's business practices, and social media was flooded with commentary from people who claimed they had always suspected something was not quite right about the Ashworth family fortune. The social consequences were swift and devastating. My parents had built their entire identity around their position in New York's elite social circles, and now they were being systematically excluded from every event, every charity board, every exclusive gathering that had once defined their lives. Former friends stopped returning phone calls, business associates distanced themselves from any connection to the scandal, and the family name that had once opened doors now made people cross the street to avoid association. Marcus called me on the third day after the story broke, his voice hollow with shock. "Bella, you need to call Mom and Dad. Mom has not left her bedroom since the story came out, and Dad is talking about doing something desperate." "Something desperate like what?" I asked, though I was not particularly concerned about their emotional state. "He keeps talking about leaving the country, about moving money to accounts where the government cannot touch it. I think he is planning to run." This was actually better than I had hoped. If my father tried to flee or hide assets, it would only make his legal situation worse and provide additional evidence of his guilt. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You and Vivian need to distance yourselves from Mom and Dad immediately. Hire your own lawyers, make it clear that you had no knowledge of their criminal activities, and do not let them drag you down with them." "But they are our parents," he protested weakly. "They are criminals who have been lying to all of us for years," I replied sharply. "They destroyed our family the moment they decided to build their fortune on stolen money. I am just the one who finally exposed the truth." The next development came from an unexpected source. Helen Martinez called me with news that made my victory complete. "Isabella, I have been working with the federal prosecutors on your family's case, and they want to offer you full immunity in exchange for your cooperation in their investigation. Apparently, some of the business documents they seized contain signatures that appear to be yours, probably from when you were a minor and your parents had you sign things without explaining what they were." "What kind of cooperation do they want?" I asked. "Testimony about your family's business practices, access to any additional documents you might have, and a detailed timeline of when you became aware of their criminal activities. In exchange, you will be completely protected from any potential charges, and you will be eligible for a substantial reward under the federal whistleblower program." The irony was perfect. Not only was I going to escape any legal consequences for my family's crimes, I was actually going to be rewarded for exposing them. The government was going to pay me to destroy the people who had thrown me away like garbage. But the best news was yet to come. 2 weeks after the initial story broke, I received a call from the law firm that had originally established my grandfather's trust. Apparently, the criminal investigation had triggered a review of all family assets, and they had discovered something that changed everything. "Miss Ashworth," the lawyer explained, "we have been reviewing the trust documents in light of recent developments, and we need to inform you that your status as an adopted child actually strengthens your legal position rather than weakening it. Your grandfather specifically included language protecting adopted grandchildren from discrimination, and your parents' attempt to remove you from the trust based on your adoption is explicitly prohibited." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means that not only do you retain your full inheritance rights, but your parents' actions constitute such a serious breach of their fiduciary duties that the court is likely to remove them as trustees and award you additional damages. Combined with the criminal forfeiture proceedings, you may end up inheriting the majority of what remains of the family assets." I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Not only had I successfully destroyed the people who had betrayed me, but I was actually going to profit from their downfall in ways I had never imagined possible. The final piece of my revenge came 3 days later, when federal agents arrested my parents at their Manhattan apartment. I watched the news coverage from my hotel room, seeing my father led away in handcuffs while my mother tried to hide her face from the cameras. The charges were extensive: tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud investors. If convicted on all counts, they would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The news anchor mentioned that the investigation had been triggered by information provided by a family member who had discovered evidence of the criminal activity. They did not mention my name, but I knew that everyone who mattered would eventually figure out that I was the one who had brought down the mighty Ashworth empire. Marcus and Vivian both called me that night, their voices breaking with a mixture of grief and anger and something that might have been respect. They were devastated by what had happened to our parents, but they also understood that I had done what needed to be done. The family that had raised us was built on lies and stolen money, and those kinds of foundations never last forever. Justice had been served, exactly the way I had planned it. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of my new apartment in San Francisco, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge while I reviewed the latest correspondence from my legal team. The federal prosecutors had secured convictions against both of my parents. My father received 28 years for financial crimes, while my mother got 15 years as an accomplice. They would both die in prison, which seemed like appropriate punishment for people who had spent decades stealing from others to fund their lavish lifestyle. The family assets had been largely liquidated to pay restitution to the investors they had defrauded, but as the lawyers had predicted, I had retained my inheritance rights and received a substantial settlement from the trust. Combined with my whistleblower reward from the government, I now had enough money to pursue whatever career path I wanted without ever having to worry about financial security again. More importantly, I had my freedom. Freedom from the obligation to love people who had never loved me back. Freedom from the constant performance of trying to earn approval from people who had decided before I was even old enough to understand what was happening that I would never be good enough for them. I had used part of my settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for adopted children pursuing careers in STEM fields. I knew firsthand how difficult it could be to succeed when you did not have a supportive family behind you, and I wanted to make sure that other young people in similar situations would have opportunities that did not depend on the whims of people who might decide to abandon them. Jessica had moved to San Francisco as well, taking a job at a biotech startup that was developing revolutionary cancer treatments. We shared an apartment in the Mission District, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to have a real family, one based on choice and mutual respect rather than biological obligation or legal documents. Marcus and Vivian had both changed their last names and moved to different cities, trying to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of our parents' crimes. We stayed in touch, but our relationship was complicated by the fact that I was the one who had destroyed the only family we had ever known. They understood why I had done it, but understanding and forgiveness were not the same thing. I had enrolled in a graduate program at UC Berkeley, pursuing a PhD in biomedical engineering with a focus on developing affordable medical devices for underserved communities. The work was challenging and meaningful, and every day I was grateful that I no longer had to pretend to care about maintaining some artificial family legacy built on criminal activity. But the most satisfying part of my new life was the knowledge that I had proven something important to myself and to the world. When people tried to destroy me, I had not just survived, I had systematically dismantled everything they had built and emerged stronger than ever. I had turned their greatest weapon against me, the revelation of my adoption, into the key to my ultimate victory. The trust fund documents that had been designed to exclude me had actually protected me. The criminal activities they had assumed I would never discover had become the foundation for my financial independence. The family connections they had thought they could sever had been replaced by genuine relationships based on mutual respect and affection. 6 months ago, I had been a young woman desperately seeking approval from people who viewed my very existence as a mistake. Now, I was an independent adult with unlimited opportunities and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served in the most poetic way possible. Sometimes I wondered if my parents, sitting in their respective prison cells, ever thought about that graduation dinner and wished they had made different choices. I wondered if they realized that their decision to publicly humiliate and abandon me had been the catalyst for their own destruction. I wondered if they understood that if they had simply treated me with basic human decency, I would have spent my life protecting them instead of exposing them. But mostly, I did not think about them at all. They had taught me that family was not about blood or legal documents or shared last names. Family was about the people who chose to love you and support you and celebrate your successes instead of resenting them. Family was about building something together that made everyone involved stronger and better. I had found that kind of family with Jessica, with my research colleagues at Berkeley, with the other scholarship recipients who sent me updates about their academic progress. I had built a life that was entirely my own, free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my childhood and adolescence. The Ashworth name that had once opened doors in New York society was now synonymous with scandal and criminal activity. But I was no longer an Ashworth in any way that mattered. I had legally changed my name to Isabella Reed, taking the surname from the foster family who had cared for me before my adoption. It felt appropriate to honor the people who had shown me genuine kindness rather than continuing to carry the name of people who had built their fortune on lies and theft. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that my parents had actually done me a tremendous favor by showing me their true nature. If they had continued to hide behind their masks of parental love and family loyalty, I might have spent my entire life trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely. Instead, their moment of cruel honesty had set me free to build something real and lasting and entirely my own. The revenge I had taken was complete, but more importantly, the life I had built in its aftermath was everything I had ever wanted and more than I had ever dared to hope for. I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not in destroying your enemies, but in proving that you never needed them in the first place. Have you ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your own well-being? What would you do if you discovered your entire family was built on lies and criminal activity? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I love hearing from people who have had to choose their own families instead of accepting the ones they were born into. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama and justice-served stories. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes walking away from toxic people is the bravest and smartest thing you can do. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your worth is not determined by other people's ability to see it. Sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose for yourself, and there is incredible strength in having the courage to start over when the people who should love you choose cruelty instead.